Week 10, Overview, Bull Market and Black Market. We'll start this unit by finishing off the Roaring Twenties with a look at their seamier side. Prohibition created an underground economy, which grew out of control until the federal government got involved. Gangsters like Al Capone came to rule whole cities through bribery and threats. In many urban centers, rackets, illegal booze, prostitution rings developed, garnished with murders. Local governments proved unable to control the corruption. It took the power of the federal government to crack down on organized crime. The legitimate economy was booming too. New technologies led to new industries: cars, radios, refrigerators, and the like. Manufacturing and marketing generated more jobs and more money. All that money opened new opportunities. In the middle of Roaring Twenties, real estate in Florida became big business. Relatively worthless land in Fort Lauderdale suddenly became more attractive as people started draining swamps and building roads. By 1928, all that prosperity led to big gains on Wall Street, on paper. Middle-class Americans saw speculators making millions, and they got in on the action too. They put in their life savings, and if that wasn't enough, they borrowed money to buy into the skyrocketing bull market. Not all Americans felt better off in the 20s, however. Farmers struggled with falling prices. Intellectuals were disgusted by what they saw as the smug hypocrisy of America. They scorned the small-town way of life at the same time they despised increasing industrialization. They mocked the crusaders and reformers who wanted to fight against social evils, yet they railed against the hypocrisy of those who secretly indulged in vice. As the presidential election of 1928 rolled around, issues included the Prohibition quandary, relief for farmers, and how to keep the prosperity going. Calvin Coolidge refused to run for re-election, so his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, ran for president, promising a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Hoover's path to the presidency included real-world experience. He graduated from Stanford University and worked as a mining engineer in the Australian goldfields. He married his college sweetheart and took her off to a new job in China in 1899, only to be caught up in the Boxer Rebellion. Hoover helped engineer the barricades and managed food provisions for the Westerners who were trapped by heavy fire for a month, and then he helped lead international troops through hostile territory into the city to relieve it. Hoover gained an international reputation as a humanitarian during World War I when he was appointed head of the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. From 1921 to 1928, he was Secretary of Commerce for both President Harding and President Coolidge. He helped organize relief efforts after several states experienced significant floods in 1927. The Republicans thought Hoover would be just the man to carry on the Coolidge legacy. The party in power tends to win when the American economy is in good shape, and it was in high gear in the election of 1928. It wasn't easy to run against the Republicans, and the Democrats made it even harder on themselves when they nominated Al Smith, an Irish-American Roman Catholic, to head the ticket. Smith had been governor of New York 4 times, but that didn't impress the Ku Klux Klan and other anti-Catholic organizations who said he was a puppet of the Pope. Smith openly campaigned for the repeal of Prohibition. Hoover publicly called Prohibition a noble experiment, even though privately he thought it had been a big mistake. By 1928, many Americans believed that Prohibition had gone from an experiment to a joke to a problem. The law did not make bad people good, but it did tempt many good people to turn bad. Americans who broke the law by buying alcohol had to get it from bootleggers who committed the bigger crimes of manufacturing, transporting, and selling it. They tolerated the police officers who gave the rum runners a pass. But bribery is more addictive than alcohol. A police officer who expected one little bottle of whiskey from an old friend could be blackmailed for accepting bribes. Soon much of local law enforcement was so compromised it couldn't stand up against the most vicious kinds of criminals who moved in to take advantage of new opportunities. A new kind of business began to appear in America, one that relied on violence to make money. An illegal business is called a racket, and there were many money-making rackets, like bootlegging, extortion, prostitution, gambling, and the like. Most of the gang violence was at first directed towards other criminals. Ordinary citizens didn't get fired up over the deaths generated by inter-gang rivalries. However, when Al Capone and his thugs hit a rival gang by gunning down 7 of its members on Valentine's Day, 1929, the American public was outraged by the brutal murder. The event became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre. People began to demand that gang-run cities like Chicago be cleaned up. The first response was from New York gangster Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who called a conference of other gangsters from across the country. He argued that Al Capone's tactics were not only brutal, but were a bad way to do business. He noted how the big capitalists made their money by creating monopolies that eliminated competition. Luciano proposed that the gangsters divide the nation into exclusive territories, too. This is how modern organized crime developed. There was another response, though, this one from the federal authorities. With so much of local law enforcement in the pocket of the gangs, the feds decided that they needed to step in to clean up the gang violence. J. Edgar Hoover, who we first encountered as Attorney General Palmer's assistant during the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, became head of a bureau within the Department of Justice in 1924. Hoover renamed his bureau the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and set himself the task of earning the public's respect for fighting crime. J. Edgar Hoover's government men, or G-men as they became known, went after organized crime with a vengeance. A 26-year-old man named Elliot Ness formed a small group of 9 men called the Untouchables, who pursued and harassed Al Capone and his operations. Although Al Capone was known as a ringleader of gambling, prostitution, murder, assault, kidnapping, extortion, and other crimes, the Untouchables knew that no prosecutor could bring him to justice for these crimes since they would never be proven in court. Thus, they decided to prosecute Capone for a crime that seemed trivial in comparison to his others. They had Capone tried and convicted for 6 years on a charge of income tax evasion. After his sentence, Capone became paralyzed, and then he went mad from the effects of untreated syphilis. As the G-men started taking down big names like Al Capone, the glory days of organized crime slowly came to an end. As the feds really started to fight the black market economy, the bull market was taking off. Under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, many Americans were making more money than ever before. In the late 1920s, people became excited about the fantastic gains that stocks offered, and they rushed to invest their disposable income in the stock market. Those who didn't have disposable income were still able to invest in the stock market by taking advantage of the easy credit that was available to purchase stocks. As more borrowed money entered the market, prices rose higher. That meant that people could cash in the shares they owned for fabulous gains, which they then plowed right back into the ever-rising market. All those paper profits led even more people to pour even more money into it. But there were signs that not all was well. Farmers didn't share the prosperity of the 1920s. Food prices were depressed during this time, causing farmers to default on loans, sell their farms, and move to the cities in large numbers. The 1920 census revealed that, for the first time, a majority of Americans lived in cities rather than farms. Farm prices weren't the only sign of trouble. Americans were making more goods than they were consuming. Companies didn't slow production, but they kept their products rolling off assembly lines and piling up in warehouses. These little warning signs weren't enough to keep people from putting all they had, and more, into the bull market. In hindsight, it was a big mistake. This week's Teacher's Notes provide resources to help your older children think about wealth and debt. What they learn about the bull market of 1928 this week might save them from financial ruin in the years to come. Hoover's term in office had hardly begun when the stock market crashed in 1929. He then lost his re-election bid to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was re-elected 3 more times after that. FDR had such a huge impact on America that dialectic students are learning about his life before he reached the White House. Let's learn what FDR was doing between the Great War and the Great Depression. As a young politician, FDR was known for his energy, enthusiasm, cheerfulness, and warm heart. He was popular and well-liked by everyone. FDR was also considered very good-looking and charming. FDR visited Europe in 1918 and came home sick with the Spanish flu, only to discover that his wife Eleanor had discovered a bundle of love letters from him to Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's social secretary. FDR and Eleanor discussed divorce, but his family told him they would disinherit him if he broke up with her. Eleanor was persuaded it was better for everyone if they stayed together. Not only would FDR's public image be ruined if they divorced, but Eleanor believed it would be better for their 5 children if they tried to salvage their marriage. FDR promised to never see Lucy again, and they stayed together. Even though Eleanor did not divorce Roosevelt, his infidelity had destroyed the trust she had in her husband. As a matter of fact, FDR did manage to see Lucy again. Eleanor never recovered from his betrayal. Though she remained married to him, their relationship was based on a partnership and mutual respect rather than any full reconciliation. FDR was 39 years old when he was diagnosed with polio. It happened in 1921, after his run for the vice presidency in 1920. Although it was a shock for him to receive the diagnosis, FDR slowly recovered his spirits and determined to make himself well. He persevered and attempted to recover by any means he could. He had to learn to walk with braces, use a wheelchair, and cope with the everyday challenges of being an invalid. Roosevelt learned to depend on others for simple daily tasks like bathing and getting dressed. Throughout the difficult days, he managed to preserve his sense of humor. From his experience with physical suffering and his complete dependence on others, Roosevelt better understood the problems of people who were suffering. The people closest to him believed that he came out of the darkest time of his sickness with a greater humility and a kinder spirit. Well, despite the damage to their marriage and to FDR's legs, Eleanor strongly encouraged FDR to get back into politics. His mother disagreed, and forcefully. But FDR had a trusted aide, Lewis Howe, who teamed up with Eleanor to convince him to return to public life. In 1924, Roosevelt was ready to get back into the political arena. He gave a dynamic speech at the Democratic National Convention in New York that put him back into the spotlight. Although the Republicans won the election that time around, FDR would be active in politics from then forward. We'll see what FDR did after the stock market crash of 1929 next week. Well, Unit 2 starts off with the end of the Roaring Twenties. Next week, we'll see how the people we bet this week deal with the sudden end of America's decade of prosperity. Brace yourself. It's going to be a wild ride. But it's a great opportunity to prepare your family to follow God as we face the challenges of our own century.